let's talk about Yuji Itadori and Kenjaku. One of the most important ongoing mysteries in JJK is the true nature of Yuji's parentage and family, because despite being the son of Kenjaku, up until very recently, Yuji was just your normal high schooler, doing incredibly normal things like breaking athletic records on accident and jumping through two-story windows. And while we do not have full confirmation as to whether or not Yuji's grandpa was in fact a sorcerer himself, it definitely seems like it's implied just because he knows that something's up with Kenjaku and he wanted to tell Yuji about his parents. And Yuji's mom is obviously one even before Kenjaku took her over. His father's side we don't know for sure, but there are some theories I want to go into because random sorcerers in Japan are not a common thing. Sorcerers in general are pretty rare, and an anti-gravity technique just vibing around Japan for a while, that's pretty notable. But whenever the conversation involves Kenjaku, things get a little more complicated because this is the same person that goes around making binding vows for over 1,000 years potentially. The interesting thing here to me is that Yuji's grandpa seemed to already know that Kaori Itadori was actually dead, and then Kenjaku came in and took her over, which brings up a ton of questions. In what possible reason would Kenjaku want this specific family? And it seems like Yuji's father, he wanted a child, so did he make a binding vow with Kenjaku to bring back his wife, or quote-unquote bring back his wife, only to have your wife mysteriously appear with some stitches on her head and be like, oh man, it's crazy that I survived, magically, they really brought me back, that brain guy. You'll never see him again though. Don't worry about it, that all worked out, and let's get busy because I'm on a schedule. And we also know Kenjaku is willing to wait a very long time to make sure his plans are perfectly set up so he can put them in motion. So Yuji's dad being some random nobody or just somebody who happens to be aware of curse energy like the cultists who were against Tengen. Personally, I don't think that's very likely, and I also think Kenjaku is responsible for the death of Yuji's dad, maybe directly or indirectly. I know, crazy take, especially after the whole she'll kill you part. And it also just seems like every character in this series is either an orphan or abused, and characters who aren't orphans become orphans, even Panda's an orphan. So really, to be a Jujutsu sorcerer means to be orphaned, unless you're Noritoshi Kamo and you just had the best home life ever. Loving parents who are alive in anime, that is barely legal. Now let's get into a more important topic of Tengen, a thumb I've talked about many times on this channel. The relationship between Kenjaku and Tengen, that's a pretty important mystery in this series. We also have a lot of hints towards it, because semi-recently we found out that Tengen, they're pretty much responsible for everything in Japan revolving around Jujutsu. Or to be more specific, the barriers she utilized to optimize curse energy in Japan are responsible for Jujutsu. And barriers in JJK, the more we get into the series, the more we realize that if you are a top tier barrier user, you just body people, or you have some ridiculous hacks. Right now, Kenjaku is in control of Tengen, so he should be able to collapse these barriers if he ever wanted to just set sorcery back 1,000 years for whatever reason. Kenjaku knows so much about Jujutsu and has so much control over the optimization of it right now that it just seems like if it weren't for statements about him getting bodied by 6 Eyes users or the way he acts around Gojo, you'd probably have some people saying that Kenjaku is secretly the most powerful character in the series, and obviously we know he's not. I'd put him at number 3. But whatever Kenjaku lacks in power, he'll make up for in years worth of planning. And many moons ago, I said that Ryomen Sukuna is the type of guy to shoot your dog. And I still hold to that statement, but before he was the Fallen, Ryomen Sukuna was in league with Kenjaku at the very least, and probably Tengen as well. And Kenjaku's whole plan from pretty much day 1 has always been the Culling game. But the real end goal for both Kenjaku and Tengen seems to be the optimization of cursed energy. And Tengen's method of achieving this seems to have been these giant barriers around Japan. And Kenjaku's plan is to force the evolution of humanity through the merger with Tengen. But when our protagonists meet Tengen for the first time, she says that for the merger to go through, the people of Japan have to be primed. And the way Kenjaku is priming Japan for this giant merger is through the custom of the Culling games. Now, a custom implies this is not a one-time thing, and the Culling games has happened before. Now, we know that Yuji was already a participant in the Culling games when it first started without even joining. And that had a lot of people asking, okay, so was Sukuna already part of a previous Culling games and now he's just carried over? And we know the Culling games, they don't end until all the players are dead, and the true purpose of them is hidden by Tengen from our protagonist. And Kenjaku says the true purpose of the Culling games is not revealed in this chapter. But an interesting thing to note is that Tengen is noted as looking just like Ryomen Sukuna, and Tengen says her appearance and control over her body is maintained by barriers and due to advanced aging. And what's really interesting to me is that Tengen says she was forced to evolve after Toji killed Riko and the Star Plaza vessel was lost. And even though characters like Yuki and Tengen say there were other Star Plaza vessels that were born or available, Tengen decided to let the evolution go through. And forced evolution, that's a term we've heard a lot in Jujutsu Kaisen, especially with characters like Yuki and Geto during the Hidden Inventory arc. And for characters like Tengen and Kenjaku, their whole plan, a lot of it just revolves around the forced evolution of humanity and the optimization of cursed energy in the first place. And the true purpose of the Culling games being hidden and everybody having to die for this giant merger creature to come off or for the games to end at all and Sukuna already being a player, it makes me wonder if the end result of the Culling games creates an ascended human like Tengen or like Ryomen Sukuna. Because before Ryomen Sukuna was the Fallen or even the title of Ryomen Sukuna, because that's not his real name. That is a title alongside the King of Curses that popped up during the Heian period after Tengen had been in Japan for over 200 years. The Culling games being a custom and the way that Tengen talks about them, it sounds like there was more than one and Kenjaku's is far from the first. Many people, including myself, expect that Sukuna participated in a previous Culling games if there was one, and if him winning a previous Culling games is the explanation for why he looks like this four-armed demon creature, I think that's a pretty reasonable explanation, because the nature of the Culling games as a ritual with a given end to optimize people or prime them to be merged with, or just use the cursed energy to bring out the forced evolution. Whichever end goal you pick, it doesn't sound very good, it sounds very bad even. And a big question a lot of people had is if Yuji was made a participant in the Culling games by Kenjaku manually. But the reason I support the idea of it being Sukuna this entire time is because we see with characters like Kenjaku when they talk to Kogen that he refers to himself in the rules as Suguru Geto. Granted, we see with characters like Kashimo and Ryu this is not the case, but their vessels have also been completely suppressed, unlike characters like Megumi or Yuji who have the ability to suppress somebody as strong as Sukuna. It's interesting to note, even though it's only mentioned once, that Megumi is an incredibly powerful vessel, potentially as strong as Yuji, though I kind of doubt it just because Yuji is a test tube baby from Kenjaku. Though it seems if you're a character like Yuji, Megumi, or Geto who's able to fight back against your controller, that your soul is still there and registered by the Kogen. Granted, that's really just speculation from me, and most of my evidence from that is just implied words from the characters and the fact that they use their names. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that Kenjaku probably had Sukuna as part of the original Culling games, or Tengen herself did, because Tengen was the one who kept Sukuna's body underneath the Star Chamber. We know that Tengen was friends with Kenjaku. Kenjaku helped Sukuna turn himself into a cursed object, and we have no idea to this day how his fingers went missing. We know that Kenjaku helped Sukuna turn himself into a cursed object at some point in the past, probably during the end of the Heian period, and given his relationship with Tengen and the fact that Tengen was the one who made this body dressed up as a Shinbutsu mummy to Sukuna's amusement, and we don't exactly know when Kenjaku and Tengen actually had their falling out, so it could have been some time in the past 600 years for all we know. So is Sukuna just the divorced monster child of Kenjaku and Tengen? I don't know, maybe, but anything involving these two is pretty suspect. And given how this four-armed King of Curses showed up in the Heian period and people just know him as this giant monster man that nobody even has an actual backstory of, not even big family members like Gojo Satoru, and the only characters that do have more information on his backstory are characters tied to Tengen like Angel, who she points out in particular, it's pretty alarming, especially when it turns out that the character Angel that Tengen knows is out there hunting down Sukuna because his reincarnation is against God's will. And in a world where characters who are inheritors of the Six Eyes are bound by fate, or more accurately, bound by cursed energy to Tengen herself, it brings up one of the most fundamental questions in JJK, which is the true nature of the human soul. Because the only characters in JJK that actually have a reincarnation and not an incarnation are cursed spirits. If the end goal of Buddhism is to escape the cycle of suffering and rebirth by achieving nirvana, it seems that a human that will never give up their ego to incarnate would never be able to reach it. At the center of all of this is Yuji Itadori, who must coexist with Ryomen Sukuna to have the cycle of curses be never-ending. And for the purposes of Jujutsu Kaisen, this may just be the stand-in for the cycle of suffering and rebirth, which Kenjaku is not trying to eliminate like Yuki was, but proliferate instead. But that's just my opinion, and I want to hear yours. What do you think the end goal of Kenjaku is, and Yuji Itadori's true purpose in this series? Let me know in the comments below, and if you like content like this, subscribe for more. And as always, thanks for watching.